Dr. Newton, your lordships, Reverend Fathers, ladies and gentlemen, what an enormous privilege to be speaking here about the life of the great John Paul. I think anyone who speaks to an audience that includes so many bishops would want to start first of all with a big thank you. Thank you to the service you give us in the church. Thank you for giving your lives to Christ and for bringing Christ to us. Thank you for being bishops of the church. Shall the rest of us give them a round of applause? The city of Newcastle in the northeast of England was for many years a centre of the mining industry. Men dug out the vast quantities of coal that lay deep beneath the city and its surroundings, and there was and is an absolutely gigantic amount of this coal, and men drew it out from under the earth, and it fired the railways and the steamships that made Great Britain a great industrial power. And in Britain there came a famous saying: when you wanted to give somebody something that they already had, something they have in great abundance, you say that you are carrying coals to Newcastle. I think that coming to Central Europe to speak to bishops and others about the great John Paul, I am certainly carrying coals to Newcastle. What can an English woman say about this great man, this hero of our time? What can I say to people who are already part of his legacy and carrying on his work? Well, first and very briefly, I must say, as an English woman, that this was the first Pope ever to visit our country. And to anyone who knows anything about English history, the arrival of a Pope, a Bishop of Rome, on English soil was something quite extraordinary and magnificent. And the sight of him going to have tea with the Queen at Buckingham Palace was just terrific. If you understand what that brought about in terms of healing and hope to my country, and is still being lived out in all sorts of good ways of goodwill between the different Christian denominations, we understand something of the hugeness of what John Paul brought to the world. Born in 1920 in Wadowice in Poland, John Paul was, in an extraordinary sense, very much a man of place and of time. The Poland into which he was born was, of course, new, reborn in 1918 after the Great War. And baby Karol Wojtyła himself exemplified something of that new, old Poland by his name, because he was named for his father, who was also Karol, but he was also named for his father's commanding officer, Karol von Habsburg, the last emperor of Austria-Hungary, that Austria-Hungary of which Wadowice was a part. John Paul grew up speaking German as well as Polish, because only 2 years before his birth, the place where he'd been born was part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And the education that he received was of a quality that was available, for example, in Vienna. He grew up knowing that he'd been named for a young man who had lost the throne of Austria-Hungary, but had also campaigned, albeit unavailingly, for peace in Europe. And his name, Karl, Carol, Charles, Charlie, was not only for his father, but for his father's commanding officer, who Karol Sr. had hugely admired, the young Archduke who later became emperor. This extraordinary heritage came into its fullness when, many, many years later, as Pope John Paul, Karol Wojtyła, beatified Emperor Karl in St. Peter's Square towards the very, very end of the 20th century. That 20th century so tragically marked by 2 world wars. Can we not see something extraordinary, some amazing sort of pattern in all of that? John Paul brought extraordinary gifts to the papacy, but probably the single most important one was this. He understood and taught the church not as an institution, not as a perfect society, not as something with rules to be imposed, but as the gift of God which answers the fundamental question, the question posed by the psalmist in the Old Testament. What is man that you bear him in mind? Mortal man that you care for him, sings the psalmist. And the question posed anew in the New Testament by the young man whose words John Paul used in his wonderful encyclical, Veritatis Splendor. What must I do to be saved? What is man? Who are we? Why are we different from animals? Are we different from animals? What is it to be a human being? Questions which perhaps until the 20th century, a lot of human beings didn't ask. It was self-evident. And the business of getting on with things, marrying, having children, surviving, working, eating, kept most people busy. Only now does man, and in particular also woman, after 2 dreadful world wars and massive social change, world wars which began in the very corner of the earth which had been most deeply enriched by Christianity, where Christianity had been fully enculturated, only at the end of the 20th century and beginning of the 21st is man really asking, who are we? How do we keep getting things wrong? And John Paul answered, not with a series of rules, not with the expectation that everybody knew the answers and should learn them by heart, but with a deep, full, passionate understanding of the need for that question and the need for its answer. What is man? John Paul explained, and most resoundingly, in that magnificent sermon in Warsaw when he went back to his own beloved Poland in 1979, he answered by saying, we cannot understand man, who he is, what his aspirations are, how he should live, what kind of world he can create and build. We cannot understand any of these things unless we understand about God. And to squeeze God out from human life is to misunderstand man, to misunderstand the human person. Now, this is a very different perspective from the popes who had come immediately before John Paul for the previous 100 years. There had been an assumption that human beings, sort of, knew about God, and that going to church was in some way part of everyone's life. John Paul understood in a profound way that this was no longer the case, and not least because he came from a country where, although church attendance was the norm, the government assumed that it should not be, and with enough propaganda, would not and could not be. John Paul understood the dilemma of modern man, and I would add, of modern woman, because he also spoke to a world which understood that women, in greater and greater numbers, were taking on all sorts of different careers and going to university and so on. John Paul did all this with a particular understanding of the beauty and the power and the importance and the creativity of words, the spoken word. A little while ago, when our beloved Pope Benedict XVI was going to come to Britain, another wonderful success actually, we had a real problem because our mass media in Britain, our newspapers, TV and radio, and not least the wretched, the BBC, denounced him blaming him entirely for a number of things, being German, which was of course entirely his fault, and being foreign, and upholding the moral law, and other dreadful things of that kind. And the newspapers and media were absolutely horrible to him. And in the run-up, the days before his arrival, it looked quite possible that what should be a wonderful event was going to be disrupted and all sorts of difficulties were going to be caused. So I decided to take a vow of silence and encourage everyone to pray that the visit would be a success, and also to sponsor me for every hour that I would remain silent, and the money would go towards paying for the cost of the visit. So I contacted the people at Westminster Cathedral, our main Catholic cathedral in London, and announced that I was doing this. And I sat in a side chapel, and the priests announced at every Mass that I was doing this, that Joanna Bogle was remaining silent for 24 hours, and nobody believed them. Unfortunately, the nice Canon Christopher Tuckwell, who announced this at the main Mass, went on to say, "We understand her husband is really thrilled." Well, I managed it, and people came into the chapel to pray silently with me that the Pope's visit would be a success. And not because of that, but because lots and lots of other people were seriously praying. It was a magnificent success, really a quite extraordinary event, building on the visit of John Paul. But while I was there, silently in the chapel of St. Joseph, because I was remaining silent, and because I heard the glorious words of the Mass again and again throughout that Sunday, obviously several Masses being said hour on hour, I pondered a lot about words. The incarnation didn't happen silently. When Christ our Saviour arrived on this earth, in Nazareth, beneath the beating heart of the Virgin Mary, it was through the spoken word. The angel Gabriel spoke to Mary, and she was startled. There was a real word, spoken and received, and she responded. There's a very profound sense in which words, language, and Christ as the living word, the Logos, the word from the beginning, it's all much more important than I had really ever imagined before. Mary's yes was also not silent. She spoke. She used her vocal cords. And today, at Mass, the Word is made flesh and dwells among us. And as the angel brought the Word to Mary, so a priest brings the Word, and it is made flesh on the altars of our churches. And the Word was more. The Word became flesh and dwelt amongst us. And at Bethlehem, when the child Jesus was venerated by the shepherds, Mary pondered all these things in her heart. She was cherishing the Word. Language is one of the things that makes us different from animals. The human ability to communicate in language, in words. John Paul understood about words. He was a magnificent communicator. One of the things that, again, our media in Britain said to be rude about him, and they needed few excuses to be rude about popes, that's the BBC for you, but one of the things they used to say was that, well, of course, he's an actor, implying somehow that he'd done a training course at the Royal Academy of Dramatic Art or similar. Well, John Paul was an actor. During the Second World War, in the appalling, truly appalling conditions of wartime Poland, he was part of the Rhapsodic Theatre, an underground theatre that kept alive the Polish language, Polish words, by bringing to life Polish plays and literature. But the Rhapsodic Theatre, obviously an amateur group, in the real sense of that word, amateur, one who loves, from the Latin, the rhapsodic theatre had a particular understanding about words. It was the theatre of the living word, where every word mattered. No props, no costumes, no music, no stage, no special lighting. And this was not so much because these things were unavailable in an underground theatre. No, it was because it was the theme of the rhapsodic theatre that the words mattered. Let the actual words of the playwright or the poet come alive. The theatre of the spoken word. And during the years that Poland was divided between the Austro-Hungarian, Russian, and German empires, the Polish language was kept alive. And the rhapsodic theatre had its origins in the houses of the Polish aristocracy, who would put on plays in the Polish language, without props, without music, without costumes, so that everyone could enjoy the spoken word and the beauty of the Polish language. John Paul brought that magic and glory of the word to the world. And yes, in that sense, he was an actor and a terrific communicator. Certainly when he spoke, do you remember that deep, rich, very Polish voice? We listened. It's true, he got the pauses right. He got the laughter right. He got an amazing rapport with his audience. But it wasn't really that. It was simply that he understood the majesty of words and the beauty and the hugeness of the privilege of communicating and the special privilege of communicating as a priest of God, as a bishop, and as the successor of St. Peter. He gave the majesty of what he was doing its full dignity, and every word mattered. There's a very important sense in which we're losing the majesty of words. Those of us for whom the English language is a native language are particularly sad when we hear some young people speaking in a very bleak, abbreviated form of it. There's a cartoon in a magazine, The Spectator magazine in Britain, of somebody receiving an award for literature and for the English language. She's standing in front of a microphone and she's saying, "Yay! When I got this award, I was like, yay!" You get the point. There is a very important sense in which the beauty of language is a gift from God. John Paul taught us about language, about the richness of words. There is something scary about modern Western Europe. First, the way we blaspheme so frequently. It's now standard to use God's name in vain in all sorts of ways, on TV, in the media, and even among Catholic young people. Also, the use of obscene language, absolutely endemic among people in Britain in everyday speech, on the train, in the buses, everywhere you hear obscenities just naturally, a loss of control of temper, language. Also, a manipulation of language, of which, of course, the most obvious would be that word choice, which means so much and could mean so much so richly, has become simply the lingua franca of the movement to allow the wholesale slaughter of unborn children. And the new use of language to manipulate, so that words like unacceptable don't just mean that I will not accept what you say, but that I would like the public authorities to stop you saying it. So there is a certain manipulation of language in the modern democracies of Europe, which is rather fearsome, and a loss of the richness of language, which certainly has something to do with the speed and immediacy of modern communications. Texting robs English of most of its adjectives, all of its pronouns, and practically all of the commas, full stops, and exclamation marks. And don't let's bother, but we could just take a brief moment to mourn the loss of the semicolon. Passing. John Paul was a man of exceptional brilliance, a philosopher, a poet, a playwright, a man who loved words, a man who loved language. He didn't, as it happens, find the English language particularly easy. And I remember him speaking in England magnificently, but with a strong Polish accent. Just recently, with the visit of Pope Benedict, the Catholic bishops of England and Wales on their website replayed some of John Paul's visit to make the connection between the two. And we heard again that deep Polish voice when he arrived at Gatwick Airport. For the first time in history, a Bishop of Rome sets foot on English soil. But he did draw out the full measure and significance of precisely that. And listen to the words, a Bishop of Rome. This was not just a TV personality arriving. And yes, there was a huge significance in the arrival of a Pope, a Bishop of Rome, a successor of St. Peter, in the land where the break with Rome was such an important part not only of British history, but of the history of the English-speaking world. For those of you who don't know the history of England, our King Henry VIII, Henry Tudor, son of Henry VII, broke with Rome because, as a Catholic king, he wanted to marry his mistress, Anne Boleyn. You may or may not know, and I don't know how this will translate, but in English schools, in British schools, our children learn about Henry VIII's 6 wives in a little rhyme. He went on to have 5 more wives after Anne Boleyn. It goes like this: divorced, beheaded, died, divorced, beheaded, survived. It's kind of, I don't know how that translates, but in English it rhymes. There was an understanding, is an understanding, and will always be, I think, deep in our history, an understanding of the connection between the papacy and the protection of marriage and family life. For it was on that issue, and not on any doctrinal issue as such, but on the fundamental human issue of marriage, that the English Reformation really hung. Can a man abandon his wife and have another one? And if so, how often? 4, 5, 6 times? How important is marriage in the great scheme of things? Is it merely a rule? Should it change? Is it a fish on Fridays rule? Or is it something deeper? Because of the peculiar circumstances of Henry VIII and the Pope, it is to me extraordinary that it was the Pope of Marriage and the Family, John Paul, who became the first Bishop of Rome to set foot on English soil. And by his mere presence to teach us that the Catholic Church not will not, but cannot, change the fundamental human reality of marriage and family life, and that this is more important, oh, much more important, than a mere set of rules. Today, to speak up for the truth of marriage and family, something which even 15 or 20 years ago, and at the time when John Paul arrived in Britain in 1982, still brought together people of different faiths and different opinions, today to speak up is to court great controversy, and even to risk public opprobrium. A great many years ago, as a borough councillor in the London borough in which I grew up, a controversy arose about whether or not to have a rather crude, pornographic, homosexual magazine in the public library, funded by public funds. I still remember the amount. It was £7.50 a year, which is not a lot of money, to pay for this wretched magazine. A member of the political party which was opposite to mine contacted me, and I was much younger then, and with apologies for the revolting nature of what he was enclosed a copy of this magazine and said, "Do you realise we're all paying for this out of public funds? I don't think we should be." I agreed with him. Found some other copies of the wretched magazine in various libraries, contacted my fellow borough councillors, and we had a debate on it in the council chamber. It caused a lot of headlines and so on at the time, but in the Britain of 25 years ago, it was possible, difficult, but possible, to have a sane debate about these things, and by an overwhelming majority it was agreed we should no longer fund this wretched magazine. I wasn't particularly popular, and occasionally I worry that someone on the internet will resurrect the story and they'll all start doing to me the sorts of things they say they should do to homophobic campaigners. Well, too bad. But now, brave indeed would be a borough councillor who tried to prevent such a magazine being subsidised by public funds. Brave indeed would be anyone who voted for this, and vanished is the tolerance, decency and goodwill that enable us to have a sane debate about this sensitive subject with respect for everyone's human dignity. I'm not calling for a great moral campaign, but I am talking about a lack of freedom to debate sensitive issues and respect for dignity in our culture. John Paul understood about the problems of public censorship. He understood very well at first hand what it is to live in a country where you are not able to speak freely. His love of words was matched by an understanding of the delicacy of language, and an understanding that freedom is not absolute. It must be, as he always emphasized, shackled, tethered to truth. Freedom and truth go together, and both are connected deeply to human dignity. And this is not about rules, but about man. What is man? He is so important. He has a value. He has a dignity. There is something about John Paul's understanding of freedom, words, and the human person that blend together. Why are we here? Who put us here? What is the object in being a human being? Where are we going? Are we just, as the slogan has it, born to shop? Or is there more to life than that? John Paul approached all these subjects not from the point of view of somebody who had all the answers pat in a set rule book, but as somebody who understood the questions, the deep questions of the human person, and knew that God had provided the answers. It was immensely thrilling, wasn't it, being young in the era of John Paul. There was something marvellous about being young with this Polish Pope. For those of us who were young in the 1980s, John Paul was our Pope. For Jamie and me, he's the Pope on that papal blessing that we got on parchment that hangs up in our room. Oh, I know lots of other people got one. But this is our papal blessing on our marriage. John Paul was my Pope, for those of us who were young when he was elected. The Pope who invented World Youth Day. The Pope who broke down barriers, who forged a special friendship with different sorts of people. The Pope who forged a real deep friendship with the Jewish people, and who spoke in a warm and rich language to people that needed a new approach there. The Pope who spoke specifically to women, who understood us, had real easy friendships with women, who didn't look terrified as some previous popes do in some photographs. Oh, it's one of them. The Pope who understood that women might have something to contribute and that it was different from men. The Pope from a country which had long believed in the education of women and who was comfortable and saw in women intellectual possibilities and gifts which needed to be nurtured and celebrated in a different way from those of men. The Pope with a great sense of humour. Do you remember how he leaned over the balcony when he was first elected and said in Italian, "I hope I can make myself understood in our Italian language, remember?" And then added, "If I make a mistake, please correct me." Can you honestly imagine Pius IX doing that? No, nor can I. The Pope who didn't ever see the message of the Church as a list of laws, but rather as an answer to the deepest questions raised by man and by woman. The Pope of poetry, beautiful poetry. The Pope who wrote plays The jeweller's shop was presented in London not so long ago to full houses. The Pope who talked frankly, often extremely frankly, about human life and human love and the transmission of life. The Pope who skied and swam and hiked in the mountains. The Pope from Poland who told us not to be afraid. The Pope who challenged us to be what we could be and should be, our better selves. The Pope who taught us by word and by example that more excellent way. Thank you to Poland and Eastern Europe for giving all of us this great and noble son. As long as I live, I'll count it a privilege to have lived during the time that John Paul carried the burden of Peter the fisherman. It was John Paul who challenged us in a new way to the new evangelization. And he's passed it on. The Pope's depending on us, you know, my nephew said, helping to found a pro-life group at his university. It's all right, Auntie Joanna. We're carrying on with the Pope, said the next one down, my niece, buckling down to get into Cologne, World Youth Day with Pope Benedict. It's all down to us, you know, said the next youngest one. This was because John Paul, in a way that no other modern pope has done, appealed to the greatness of heart among young people, and to the young in all of us who are no longer young. Do you remember that wonderful call to young people? Young people, Christ calls you. The church needs you, and the Pope believes in you and expects great things of you. There was an understanding in John Paul about life as an enormous adventure, not just the spoken word, but the lived word, taking on new challenges, even when they were difficult. The Pope who forged a new friendship with the Jewish people was also the Pope who spoke to a cheering crowd of Muslims in Morocco. The Pope who came to Britain was also the Pope who opened his heart to the people of Africa and Latin America. Remember, the first country he ever went to was Mexico. And the government there, anti-Catholic for generations, absolutely changed. This was a Pope who didn't see himself as a monarch, who understood something of what America had achieved in the world, who understood too something of what evangelical Christians had achieved in the world, and whose World Youth Day gatherings owed something to that Billy Graham big tent version of Christianity, which is not unattractive in its warmth and its simplicity, and its jollity, and its egalitarian wholeness, something the Catholic Church needed to grasp as real and beautiful. This was a Pope unafraid to learn from others, a Pope of Poland, a country which had understood for centuries about its relationship with other countries, not only because of oppression, but because of being outward going, a country from which many people had emigrated to other lands and brought back their experiences, a country of missionaries, a country where Maximilian Kolbe had taken the faith to Japan, where hundreds and thousands of Poles had settled in America, and after the Second World War, and in tragic circumstances, had also settled widely, and not least in my country. Poland was always in the Pope's heart, but he understood that patriotism isn't something narrow. It's something which should make you alive and open to other countries, their richness, their beauty, their significance, and rejoice with people of different cultures in the glory of the differences that God has made. Do you remember him in a red Indian headdress and a big Mexican hat? Remember? And how attractive that was. Thank you to Pope John Paul for his life. Thank you to Pope John Paul for just beginning the dialogue about what is man, a dialogue now so immensely enriched by the Catechism of the Catholic Church, which doesn't offer simple, pat answers, but a whole richness to reply to the questions raised by modern man and woman. Thank you to John Paul for giving us a Pope of words, the meaning of words, the richness of words, for a rich understanding of the Incarnation, the eternal Word. Thank you to John Paul for making the words Pope and youth together, always together, Think about Rio de Janeiro last year. Remember? 3 million young people on a beach? 4 million, somebody's saying. On a beach with the Pope? Not known in the 19th century, or even in the early part of the 20th. Now, it would be unthinkable not to have a World Youth Day. And may I put in a tiny pitch? We'd love to have one in London in 10 years' time. It doesn't always rain in England. It rains a lot, but it doesn't always rain in England, and you can always carry an umbrella. So after Poland, and then there'll be somewhere else, maybe. To understand the modern church, we have to explore the life of John Paul. This is not to denigrate his predecessors. Indeed, one of the greatest things he gave us was a sense of the continuity of history. It is certainly not to denigrate our present Holy Father, whose jollity and good cheer owes much to that tradition established by John Paul and who is continuing it. Nor is it to denigrate the great and blessed, wonderful Benedict XVI, who charmed the hearts of everyone in Britain when he came, so that the people of our mass media had to tear up their scripts and speak instead about this gentle, delightful scholar with the white hair, who blessed babies and spoke so beautifully to our young. I must just add a brief anecdote here. Following the example of John Paul, who was so charming with children, Benedict XVI, when he was in Britain, blessed many babies and kissed the top of each little downy head. Absolutely charming. On the third day of his visit in Britain, there were a whole group of young mothers in Wimbledon, where he was staying at the nunciature. We use this expression in England for young, glamorous mothers, a yummy mummy. Well, there were all these yummy mummies with their babies, and somebody from the television said, "Why are you here? Are you Catholic?" "No, not especially." "Well, we want the Pope to bless our babies." And they understood at some level that the Pope was conveying something beautiful, something loving. I just love that. And the Pope did indeed bless their babies. Thank you to John Paul for establishing something special with the papacy. Thank you, Eastern Europe, for giving us this great son. We can look ahead with a greater confidence in this 21st century, in this anniversary year of that first terrible war, the war which nevertheless gave us a great saint in Karl von Habsburg. We can look ahead with some confidence in this 25th anniversary year of the destruction of the Berlin Wall. And we can do this because of that great saint, Saint John Paul. And let's remember his message. Christ calls us, the church needs us, and the Pope believed in us and expected great things of us.